Hello everyone and welcome to our third lesson in our Germany unit. Today we're looking at social and political instability and the challenges faced by the Weimar government. Your starter today is to write down who Weimar had to rely on to stop these uprisings and why did they need to rely on them. And there's an image at the bottom of your screen which will give you a hint as to who they had to rely upon. So again, let's take some time to get out a sheet of lined paper. Let's write down our title, learning objective, and our starter. Pause the video and take a few moments to answer. When you feel that you're ready to move along, you can go ahead and hit play, and we'll be taking up the starter together. So who did Weimar need to rely upon? Well, we've learned that they relied on the Freikorps to crush various uprisings from communist groups as well as right-wing groups such as the Nazis. Now, Weimar was too weak to stop these uprisings on their own, so they actually resorted to using the Freikorps, and this was known as the Free Army, as an army for hire, to use them as and when needed. Essentially, an uprising would begin, perhaps it was the Spartacist uprising or the Munich Push. What they would do was they would ring up the army and say, "We've got a job for you to do, come on and crush the uprising," and then go back to training as normal. We also have some keywords to look at. We have socialist, communist, Bolshevik revolution, nationalist, and KPD. And as always, please pause the video now. Try to match them up in your head as best you can. And when you're ready, you can hit play and we'll be taking these up together. So you've had a chance to look at these keywords. The first one that we're looking at is socialist, and this is the belief in state ownership, that the local government within a country, they're the ones who kind of control the means of production. This is different from communism, where it believed that the state should own the means of production and distribution. This follows the teachings of Karl Marx. So socialism believes in kind of state ownership. Communists believe that the state should own everything and do everything for you. And Hitler would regard communism as having too much control. The Bolshevik Revolution. This was a revolution in Russia in 1917 and 1918 where people overthrew the Tsar Nicholas II. Essentially, he was the king of Russia. He was very rich and they were very poor, and they overthrew him and installed a new government under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. Nationalist. A person who has a passion and devotion to their own country. You might remember in previous lessons we looked at the four main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And lastly, the KPD, Communist Party Deutschland, KPD. In English, it's the German Communist Party. So go ahead, pause the video, and double check you have those key terms in the right places. When you're ready, you can go ahead and hit play. Who wanted a revolution? Well, in 1917, we know that the Russians had their own revolution where they overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. And the Germans kind of looked to the Russians and said, well, they're communists, so they're not too bright. So even if they can have a revolution, we can have an even better one in our own country. So there were a few groups of people who were quite keen for a revolution to take place. One of those groups was ex-soldiers. A lot of them still had their guns, they were still armed, and they wanted revenge for the Treaty of Versailles and revenge on the November criminals. And those were the politicians who signed away the country under the Treaty of Versailles. The next group are the communists. They want to set up their own state. They saw that Germany is in complete chaos. No one knows who's in charge. So here's our chance to kind of slip in and take the country over. And the nationalists, they wanted to set up their own nationalist state, again, in the chaos of post-war Germany. They wanted to, for quoting Trump, to make Germany great again. And they saw an opportunity with the social disorder being caused by Weimar. So on the topic of revolutions, they were taking place in the streets, and we can see an image here on the bottom right-hand side where we actually have some members of the Nationalist Party who have set up a machine gun in the middle of the street, and they're trying to take control of a specific area of Munich. Now, assassinations were quite common of leading politicians. There were murders taking place of opposition leaders, vandalism, and in many situations, innocent bystanders, people who were just on their way to work or to get their shopping, were often caught in the crossfire. Weimar was having a very difficult time containing these revolutions, and they knew that they could use the Freikorps not for an extended period of time, but just for the time being. They needed to have a way to ensure that these revolutions would stop by showing the people of Germany that they will fix the problems that they are facing. And that's going to be a major challenge for Weimar to solve those economic issues caused by the Treaty of Versailles, but also the fact that there's unpopularity and a confusing ruling system as well.
Germany had never known anything other than an autocratic ruler until the end of the First World War. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm in 1918 meant the hasty formation of a democratic government. This government faced difficulties in the form of uprisings from the extreme left and right of the political spectrum. Due to the Spartacist uprising, the new provisional government was forced to move from Berlin to a place called Weimar. It was here that they drew up the new constitution for Germany, hence the name Weimar Republic. The constitution was quite forward-thinking for its time. It included voting rights for men and women over the age of 20, and voting was by proportional representation, which was seen as fairer than the first-past-the-post system employed in most countries. Proportional representation meant that a party which received 5% of the votes would gain 5% of the seats in the Reichstag. The Reichstag was to be the sovereign authority of the state, a parliament elected every 4 years. A president, to be elected every 7 years, had to submit to the powers of the Reichstag. The chancellor would head the cabinet, also responsible to the Reichstag. Local governments were tasked with securing a healthy dwelling for every German, and a place for German families to live and work appropriate to their needs. New labour laws granted workers rights under unfair dismissal, and factory councils were instituted in every factory to give workers a say in how the factory was run. It was these socialist elements of the Constitution that led to opposition from the extreme right. Historian William Shirer described the Weimar Constitution as, on paper, the most liberal and democratic document of its kind the 20th century has ever seen, full of ingenious and admirable devices which seemed to guarantee the working of an almost flawless democracy. There were, however, two main problems with the Constitution. The first was proportional representation. Under this system, as we have said above, a party that received 5% of the votes would gain 5% of the seats in the Reichstag. This meant that many smaller parties had to be consulted in the decision-making process, and by 1933 there were over 40 political parties in the Reichstag. The largest party, the Social Democrats, only secured around 25% of the votes, meaning they had to enter into alliances or coalitions with other political parties. This led to infighting, arguments, and weak government. It also gave extremist parties more of a chance to be elected and have a voice in the democratic process. Between 1919 and 1928, there were 15 different governments formed, none of them lasting for longer than 18 months. The only thing which all parties could agree upon was attacking the Treaty of Versailles and refusing to comply with the peace terms. This led to problems with foreign powers. The second major problem was Article 48 of the Constitution. This allowed the President to dissolve the Reichstag and order new elections. In times of emergency, the President could completely suspend the Reichstag and rule by himself. In effect, this was a legacy of the old autocratic role of the Kaiser and was supposed to keep Germany strong in times of difficulty. However, as we shall see, it allowed Adolf Hitler to come to power by means he could claim were democratic.
So your task now is to have a look at the image here showing all of the uprisings that took place kind of between 1919 and 1923, and to make a timeline of the uprisings using this image below. Now there are 8 different events, and if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see 2 red circles. So if there's a picture of a flame, it's a left wing or a workers' uprising. And if you look towards the middle right, there's a skull and crossbones, and that means it's a right-wing putsch. A putsch is another word for kind of an overtake or an uprising as well. So you'll have to find all 8 of those events on the image and put them into the correct chronological order. So for example, If we look over on the left-hand side, you'll see communist uprising in the Ruhr, March to April of 1920. So we need to identify that it's in the Ruhr, so the location, the date, so March to April, and the year of 1920, as well as who was doing it. So this was the communists. So go ahead and pause the video now. You're going to be looking for the flames and the skull and crossbones and arranging these in order in a timeline. When you feel that you're finished, go ahead and hit play, and we'll be taking up the timeline on the next slide. So having a look at our timelines, we should have the following events in the following order. And just for the sake of organization, any communist uprisings will appear in red. Any right-wing uprisings, also known as pushes, these will occur in green. And any uprising by the workforce, those will be in yellow. So we should be starting off in January of 1919 with the Spartacist uprising. The Spartacists were a group of communists who had an uprising in Berlin, and this is kind of the first real uprising that's going to take place against Weimar. The next will be the Kapp Push in Kustrin, and this took place between the 13th and 17th of March in 1920, and this is a putsch. In March to April of 1920, so happening simultaneously, the communists had an uprising in the Ruhr area. The Ruhr is a very industrial area in Germany. This is where most of the factories were. Now, in April of 1920, the workers also had an uprising in Plauen. In March of 1921, there was also a workers' uprising in Halle. In October, specifically the 1st of October 1923, there was a push by the Black Reichswehr. Now, the Reichswehr was the army, essentially, that was controlled by the Weimar government. The Blacks Reichswehr, these were soldiers who kind of went against Weimar themselves. There was a communist uprising in Hamburg in October of 1923, and it all finishes off with the Munich Putsch. You'll often see this referred to as the beer hall putsch because it actually took place in a beer hall, like a very big pub. This was by Hitler, and this took place between the 8th and 9th of November in 1923. So again, pause the video, have a quick look, and make sure that you have the following events as well as the dates for each of these events that took place between 1919 and 1923. When you're finished, you can go ahead and hit play. And our final task is to culminate essentially what we've learned over the last 3 lessons, because there has been a lot of information put forth for us. We just want to make sure that we can consolidate this and put it together into 3 separate mind maps. We have a mind map for government structure, a mind map for conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, and a mind map for the problems faced by Weimar. Now, there's more than 4 points that you can include in each mind map. We'll have 4 points for our own argument's sake. But feel free to add more if there's more information that you have to add. So please pause the video now, make 3 mind maps on your page, go back through your notes, try to find at least 4 pieces of information for each mind map, and when you're ready, you can hit play and we'll take these up together. Great, so you've had a chance to make these 3 mind maps. So looking at government structure, there are some things that are important for us to know. It's important to know that the president was elected every 7 years, and members of the Reichstag were elected every 4 years. Men and women over the age of 20 were permitted to vote in these elections, and the chancellor was the guy who ran the country on a day-to-day basis. The president was too busy running the army, doing other things. It was a chancellor who was involved in that kind of running of the nation, and they'd be viewed similarly today as a prime minister. Looking at problems faced by Weimar, Dolchstoss, that's the stab in the back theory. Weimar was incredibly unpopular. There were a lot of issues the country was facing, economic issues, organizational issues, as well as several uprisings by the communists, by the nationalists, and reparation payments were extremely high. So for these reasons, Weimar was facing some significant challenges in their early days. In conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, Well, the army was limited to 100,000 soldiers, which is by no means enough soldiers to defend a nation successfully. Furthermore, they weren't permitted to have any Air Force tanks or submarines. Paying 6,600 million in reparations to be paid, which is far more money than Germany had to spend. And they also lost 13% of their colonies in total land space, which means things like iron ore, timber, all of these natural resources that you would get from different areas of your country were lost as well.